There's something about Lawrence Taylor that is larger than life.
LT was a bad mother.
Back looking in, don't hit. Taken down by Taylor.
We don't even have that defense. I said, well, you better put it in on Monday because it's a doozy. I've had some great coaches in my life. When Bill Parcells allowed me to be a part of the show.
Ray Lewis called him a dominant force. Mike Singletary said he intimidated everyone. And when you watch Lawrence Taylor destroy quarterbacks on film, you'd think the entire league agreed he was a monster. But here's the thing. Before LT became the most feared player in football history, he was actually celebrated as one of the most beautiful athletes anyone had ever seen. Singletary himself admitted watching Taylor do things that were the most beautiful he'd ever witnessed on a field. So how does someone go from being admired for grace to being remembered for violence? That's the story nobody tells you about Lawrence Taylor. When Mike Singletary talks about LT, he gets this conflicted look. He didn't like Lawrence because of how he just intimidated people, but then he'd see Taylor move like a ballerina and do stuff nobody had ever seen before. Ray Lewis spent his entire career trying to find another LT and never could. These weren't just good players talking, these were legends who dominated the game themselves. But even they had to admit Taylor existed on a different level. The question everyone asked wasn't whether LT was great, it was whether anyone should be allowed to play football the way he did. Most people think a sack is just tackling the quarterback behind the line. Lawrence Taylor had a very different definition. He said a sack is when you run up behind somebody who isn't watching and you really put your helmet into him. That wasn't the disturbing part. Taylor explained that he really tried to make the quarterback see 7 fingers when they held up 3. He'd drive his helmet in or bring his arm up over his head and try to axe the guy in 2. His exact words. As long as the quarterback held the ball, Taylor intended to hurt him. Not just tackle him, not just stop the play, hurt him. Make him forget for a few seconds that he was even on a football field. This wasn't trash talk or exaggeration. Taylor meant every word. He approached football with a philosophy that the game wasn't for the weak of heart. He believed every day you had 100 reasons to take those pads off and quit, but the players who stayed were the ones willing to embrace the violence. While other defenders tried to stay within the rules for the sake of the game, Taylor always had the ability to turn up the intensity. That ability separated him from everyone else. He didn't just play aggressive football, he weaponized aggression into a tactical advantage that opposing teams couldn't counter. Bill Parcells understood something other coaches didn't. He believed fear played a big role in the game because of Lawrence Taylor. This wasn't normal football intimidation. Defensive back Beasley Reese saw quarterbacks look at Lawrence and forget the snap count. Just forget it. Parcells noticed the symptoms in opposing quarterbacks every week. Intimidation, lack of confidence, quick throws, nervous feet, concentration lapses, constantly wanting to know where Lawrence was. Taylor didn't just beat you physically, he lived in your head all week. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how violent LT really was, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me if you think a player like Lawrence Taylor would even survive in today's NFL with all the safety rules. I'm curious what you think. Jerry Sizemore played offensive tackle for the Philadelphia Eagles. He said the week leading up to a Giants game would unnerve him. By the middle of the week, something would come over him and he'd just start sweating. That's not game day nerves. That's genuine fear. Sizemore retired after the 1984 season, and he told people exactly why. Early in a game against the Giants, Taylor just looked at him and laughed. Right there. Sizemore thought he had to get out of the game. Think about that. A professional football player quit because Lawrence Taylor laughed at him before the snap. That's not dominance. That's psychological warfare. The moment everyone remembers happened on November 18, 1985. Joe Theismann dropped back to pass and Lawrence Taylor came screaming off the edge. What happened next got shown on live television and changed football forever. Taylor hit Theismann and his leg snapped. Not injured, snapped. The sound echoed through the stadium. For the first time in his career, Lawrence Taylor panicked. He was genuinely frightened at what he had done. He was the first player to call for a medic. Here's a guy who spent his entire career trying to hurt people, saying he wanted to axe them in 2, and even he got scared when he saw the result of his violence. That tells you how far over the line his playing style actually was. The Theismann incident became the defining image of what Lawrence Taylor represented. It wasn't just a football injury, it was a public demonstration of what happens when violence becomes the primary tool of dominance. Television cameras captured everything. Millions of people watched in real time as Taylor's philosophy of intentional harm produced a consequence so severe that even he couldn't handle it. The image of Taylor frantically waving for medical help while Theismann writhed on the ground became burned into football history. It was the moment when everyone understood that LT's brand of football carried costs nobody had fully considered. But this is where Lawrence Taylor becomes impossible to understand. The same guy who destroyed Joe Theismann's career, the same guy who made Jerry Sizemore retire, moved on the field like nobody had ever seen. Singletary kept saying it. Taylor looked like a ballerina. His movements weren't scripted, they weren't in any playbook. Taylor himself admitted he made it up as he went and did what he wanted, what he felt. He had this freedom other players didn't have because nobody could teach what he did naturally. It wasn't coaching, it was chaos with a purpose. Bill Parcells eventually realized you couldn't coach Lawrence Taylor. You had to just let him do his thing. That's a massive risk for a head coach. Defenses work because everyone does their job. If one player freelances, the whole thing falls apart. But Parcells understood that Taylor's unscripted genius was worth the gamble. Teammate Harry Carson told Lawrence to just go ahead and do his thing, that they had him covered. The rest of the Giants' defense, the Big Blue Wrecking Crew, held everything together while Taylor ran wild. That's how good he was. An entire defensive scheme bent around letting one player break all the rules. Here's what made blocking Lawrence Taylor impossible. He stood 6'3" and weighed 237 pounds, but he ran the 40-yard dash in around 4.6 seconds. That combination didn't exist in the early 1980s. Offensive linemen were barely bigger than him. Some interior linemen only weighed 250 or 260 pounds. They weren't built to handle his speed. The NFL had changed the rules in 1978 to let offensive linemen use their hands in pass blocking. That was supposed to help them. It did the opposite against Taylor. He'd use his speed to run right past tackles before they could get their hands on him. The rule designed to protect quarterbacks became useless because Lawrence Taylor arrived at exactly the right moment to exploit it. The timing of his arrival created a perfect storm. The league had just opened up the passing game by allowing linemen to use their hands, expecting this would give offenses more protection. What they didn't anticipate was a linebacker fast enough to make that protection irrelevant. Taylor exploited a gap in the evolution of the game. The rules had changed, but the athletes hadn't caught up yet. Offensive linemen were still being drafted and developed based on the old model. Big, strong guys who could anchor and push. Nobody was looking for the kind of quick-twitch athlete who could mirror a speed rusher like Taylor. That gap lasted for years, and during that window, Lawrence Taylor was essentially unblockable by conventional means. Before Taylor showed up, teams used running backs to block linebackers. That's just what you did. Running backs would chip or block whoever came through. Taylor made that strategy suicidal. Running backs trying to block him were smaller, weaker, and surprisingly often slower than Lawrence Taylor. There's a story about a Falcons running back who tried to block Taylor and had to be carried off the field on a stretcher. Parcells confirmed that teams figured out very quickly they couldn't block Lawrence with a running back. So the question became, who do you block him with? This is where Lawrence Taylor changed football economics forever. Since most quarterbacks are right-handed, their left side is their blind side. They can't see defenders coming from that direction. Taylor and Parcells preferred him rushing from the blind side to maximize the threat. Taylor said it perfectly. Why the hell would I want to come from where he can see me? He also pointed out that it wasn't really called the blind side when he came into the league. It was called the right side. It became the blind side after he started knocking people's heads off. His words again, teams suddenly needed a very specific type of player. You needed someone big enough and strong enough to hold the line, but also quick enough and agile enough to match Lawrence Taylor's speed. That player didn't really exist before, so the left tackle position was basically invented to stop him. By 2005, left tackle became the second highest paid position in the NFL after quarterback. Lawrence Taylor didn't just dominate games. He created an entirely new economic market in professional football. Teams started spending millions of dollars in premium draft picks on left tackles for one reason: to protect against the next Lawrence Taylor. The economic impact extended beyond just salaries. College programs began recruiting different types of athletes for the offensive line. High school coaches started identifying quick-footed linemen instead of just big bodies. Scouting departments rewrote their evaluation criteria. The entire pipeline of football talent development shifted because Lawrence Taylor proved that speed and violence from the edge could destroy traditional offensive strategies. One player forced an industry-wide transformation that touched every level of the sport. Joe Gibbs saw what was happening and did something radical. After watching Taylor sprint past blockers like they weren't there and clobber Joe Theismann from behind, Gibbs invented the one-back offense. He took out a running back and put in a bigger, stronger tight end to double-team Taylor. This wasn't a small adjustment. This was redesigning offensive football because one defensive player was too dangerous to handle with traditional schemes. Bill Walsh started using offensive tackles to block Taylor, something nobody did before. That became standard practice for picking up blitzing linebackers. But it started because of LT. The preparation for playing the Giants became obsessive. Theismann talked about Washington's film sessions. Most Giants players got marked with X's or O's. Lawrence Taylor got his own number, 56. They'd mark him as Little Red 56 and circle him on every single play. The entire week's preparation centered on one goal: identify where Lawrence is on every play. Think about how insane that is. Professional football teams with 53 players on the roster spent their entire week game planning for one guy. That's not respect, that's survival. Lawrence Taylor forced the outside linebacker position to evolve decades ahead of schedule. Before him, outside linebackers played read and react. They waited to see what happened and responded. Taylor turned the position into attack mode. He was a pure edge rusher who penetrated and brought relentless pressure. That became the blueprint. Players like Simeon Rice and Julius Peppers modeled their games after what Taylor created. The entire defensive philosophy shifted because of how he played. As teams started scheming better against him, Taylor adapted. He introduced a new technique. Instead of just sacking the quarterback, he'd chop the ball out of his hands to force turnovers. This was a team-first strategy that actually lowered his sack totals but increased the Giants' chances of winning. He went from relying purely on athletic dominance to engineering higher-value plays through technique. Most players who lose their physical edge fade away. Taylor got smarter and stayed elite. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The modern NFL exists specifically to prevent another Lawrence Taylor. All those quarterback protection rules, all the penalties for hitting defenseless players, all the safety protocols, they're designed to stop what he did. Taylor admitted he'd get thrown out of games so often in today's league that he might end up owing the team money. When someone asked if he'd conform to modern rules, he laughed and said, "Have you ever known me to conform to anything?" The league literally changed its fundamental rules because Lawrence Taylor's style of play was too violent to allow anymore. The irony is that Taylor's dominance created the very system that would eventually reject him. Every rule change stemmed from a specific problem he created. Blindside hits became regulated because of how he terrorized quarterbacks from their weak side. Defenseless player protections emerged because his hits were so devastating they ended careers. The league watched what one player could do when violence met genius and decided that combination was too dangerous to exist. They didn't ban Lawrence Taylor specifically, but they banned everything that made him Lawrence Taylor. This is what makes his legacy so complicated. Ray Lewis had that "I just don't care about nobody" mentality when describing Taylor's approach. "Football isn't a game for the weak of heart," Taylor said, "because every day you've got 100 reasons to take all those pads off and quit." He embraced that philosophy completely. His entire career was built on the idea that you could turn up the intensity and hurt people within the rules. Except his version of hurt wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. Make them see 7 fingers. Axe them in 2. Forget where they are. That's not football as a sport. That's football as controlled violence. Mike Singletary's conflicted feelings make perfect sense now. How do you admire someone for being beautiful while hating them for being brutal? Taylor was both. He moved with grace nobody could match while hitting with force nobody wanted to experience. He changed blocking schemes, created new positions, forced rule changes, and traumatized opponents so badly they retired rather than face him again. The Big Blue Wrecking Crew backed him up while he did whatever he wanted. Parcells gave him freedom because controlling Taylor meant losing what made him special. The numbers tell. Part of the story: 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards, 2 Super Bowl championships, only defensive player to win MVP since 1971. But the real story is in what he forced everyone else to do. Joe Gibbs inventing new offenses, teams spending millions on left tackles, quarterbacks forgetting snap counts, Jerry Sismore sweating through practice week, Joe Theismann's legs snapping on national television, Bill Belichick saying Taylor dominated from his first day of practice, Harry Carson telling him they had his back while he broke every conventional rule. So before you comment about how great Lawrence Taylor was, remember what that greatness actually meant. It meant fear as a defensive weapon. It meant intentional violence designed to incapacitate. It meant a playing style so extreme that the NFL had to fundamentally change to make sure it never happened again. Taylor himself acknowledged the modern game wouldn't tolerate what he did. The league made sure of that. They created rules, changed economics, and redesigned offensive strategy, all because one player proved that unchecked dominance breaks the game. Drop a comment right now and tell me honestly, was Lawrence Taylor's violence necessary for his greatness? Or did football become better when the league made his style of play illegal? Because that's the real question his career forces us to answer. Lawrence Taylor represents something football will never see again. Not because players aren't talented enough, or athletic enough, or aggressive enough. They absolutely are. But because the sport evolved specifically to prevent anyone from playing the way he did. He was the most beautiful and most brutal player in NFL history, and both of those things were equally true at the same time. Mike Singletary was right to be conflicted. Ray Lewis was right to never find another LT. And the NFL was probably right to change the rules. The league today is safer, more structured, and more protective of its players. Those are good things. But they came at a cost. We'll never see another player move like a ballerina while hitting like a freight train. We'll never see another defensive player so dominant that teams invent new positions just to slow him down. We'll never see another outside linebacker who makes offensive coordinators redesign their entire playbook. Lawrence Taylor was a singular force who arrived at the perfect moment, when the rules allowed him to exist and the athletes around him couldn't stop him. That moment is gone forever. Whether you think that's progress or loss depends on how much you value safety over the kind of violent genius that changes sports history. Either way, there will never be another Lawrence Taylor. The game literally won't allow it.